The day started like any other, but I knew it wasn't going to be. I was supposed to be in Nashville, Tennessee, recording new music, but I had no idea what was about to hit me. It was March, and I was supposed to make a new gospel album, a Christmas album, a regular album, and a bunch of singles. But things didn't go as planned. I got sick, and everything went downhill fast. I started the session with a song called "The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face." I tried to sing it as a duet with Ginger Holiday, one of my backing singers. It didn't work out. I ended up singing it solo, but it was a disaster. The song is delicate, but I just steamrolled through it with a heavy arrangement. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I was just not feeling it. Then I sang Amazing Grace. It's a classic, but the version we recorded was kind of boring. Later, they found a different take that was way better, but I never understood why they didn't use it. Maybe I was too focused on something else. Next, I recorded 2 folk songs by Gordon Lightfoot, For Lovin' Me and Early Morning Rain. I actually liked these. They were low-key, and I felt the songs. For Lovin' Me was the best. It's about a guy who breaks hearts, and I felt like I was living that character. But then it all went wrong. I had to go to the hospital because of my eyes. I was dealing with glaucoma, and that put a stop to everything. I thought I'd be back in a blink, but it took longer than I expected. When I finally got back to the studio in May, things were different. I was in the same place with the same people, but something was off. I just wasn't into it. Maybe it was the meds, maybe it was boredom, or maybe I just didn't want to be there. We started with Miracle of the Rosary. It was a religious song, and I sang it with all my heart, but it was still a dud. The arrangement was overdone, and it didn't feel right. Then we did some Christmas songs, even though it was the middle of May. They set up a tree in the studio, but it didn't help. It Won't Seem Like Christmas Without You was okay, but my voice was off. I sounded tired and thin. If I Get Home on Christmas Day was even worse. My voice was all over the place, and the arrangement just made it worse. It sounded like I was trying too hard, and it didn't work. I tried to sing Padre, a song I used to love, but it was a mess. I sang it too loud and too high. I knew it wasn't good, but I just kept going. It was painful, but I didn't stop. Holly Leaves and Christmas Trees was a bit better. My friend Red West wrote it, and I felt more engaged. I sounded better, and it was a nice, quiet moment in the middle of the chaos. Merry Christmas Baby was the highlight. It's a slow blues, and I had fun with it. I shouted to the band and sang off mic during the breaks. It was the blues, and it felt right. It was the only time during those sessions that I really felt like I was in my element. But then we did Silver Bells, and it was like a step back. It's a classic, but it felt bland. I was singing it after Merry Christmas Baby, and it was hard to go from a blues masterpiece to something so tame. The next night, things were a mix of good and bad. I started with a jokey version of the Lord's Prayer. I was fooling around, but it was a strange choice for a religious guy like me. We did more Christmas songs, but they were hit or miss. I'll Be Home on Christmas Day was one of the better ones, but the strings and vocals drowned it out. On a Snowy Christmas Night was more traditional, and I sounded better, but it was still not great. Winter Wonderland was a snooze. I sounded uninterested, and the arrangement was boring. But O Come All Ye Faithful was a surprise. The arrangement was different, and it worked. I barely sang at the start, but it was a cool touch. The first Noel was the worst. My voice was terrible, and the arrangement was non-existent. It was a dirge, and I shouldn't have released it. We wrapped up with The Wonderful World of Christmas, a new song that was old-fashioned. It was okay, but not memorable. In the middle of it all, we jammed on Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. I only knew 2 verses, but we kept going for 11 minutes. It was the only time I really felt alive during those sessions. I was having a great time, and my voice was good. It was cut down to 3 minutes on the album, but the full version is amazing. The next day, we did Help Me Make It Through the Night. I'd been wanting to record it for a while, but it didn't work. The arrangement was clunky, and it felt lifeless. Until It's Time for You to Go was the same. I tried to make it a big ballad, but it just didn't fit. I tried again at the next session, but the first version ended up as a single. It didn't do well, but it was out there. I thought I was back on top, but something was off. I just couldn't shake it. Elvis finally turned back to his gospel album one evening, and Lead Me, Guide Me became one of the standout tracks. The song felt like a heartfelt prayer, and Elvis sang it with a relaxed but sincere voice. His voice blended beautifully with the Imperials, and you could tell he really loved the song. Later, he even brought it back during a gospel jam session while they were filming Elvis on tour. The next day, we recorded some fun jams like Johnny B. Good and Lady Madonna. Elvis's voice sounded great during these informal sessions, and it made me wish he'd spent more time recording Lady Madonna properly. The following evening, though, started with a not-so-great version of Fools Rush In. Elvis had a much better version of this song from 1966, and this new take was kind of lazy. It was okay, but nothing special. Elvis then got back to the gospel album and sang He Touched Me. The song was beautiful, but sometimes Elvis took breaths in the middle of lines, which broke up the flow a bit. I wondered why he didn't work on those small details, given how long he'd been in the business. I've Got Confidence was a different kind of gospel song with a rock feel. Elvis gave it a tougher edge, and even though his voice was a little rough, he seemed really into it. He made sounds between the lines, which showed he was really engaged. An evening prayer was another highlight. A few days earlier, Elvis had done a fun, light-hearted version of the Lord's Prayer, but this time he sang an evening prayer with a lot of feeling, almost like a tribute to Mahalia Jackson. It was a stunning performance, simple but totally moving. The next night, we started with more gospel songs. Seeing is Believing was decent but not great. The song just didn't flow as well as I've Got Confidence. Then we did A Thing Called Love, where Elvis sang in unison with Armand Morales. It was a strange performance, and Elvis was barely audible at times. It was hard to tell what he was trying to achieve, but it didn't quite work. The second half of the night, Elvis sat at the piano and recorded 3 songs. It's Still Here, I'll Take You Home Again, Kathleen, and I Will Be True. These were some of the best recordings of the whole week. The arrangements were simple, and Elvis was completely lost in the music. His voice wasn't perfect, but it didn't matter because he was so engaged. These songs were later tampered with, but the raw versions are the best. The following night, we shifted to secular material. I'm Leavin' was the first song, and it was the best of the 3 we recorded that night. Elvis worked on an engaging arrangement, and his vocal was beautifully restrained. It should have been a hit, but it only reached #36 on the charts. Maybe it was too subtle for radio listeners, or maybe Elvis didn't promote it enough. The next 2 songs, We Can Make the Morning and It's Only Love, weren't as successful. We Can Make the Morning had a big chorus, but the performance was ragged, and it just didn't come together. It's Only Love sounded too artificial and lacked the country, blues, or gospel elements that usually brought out the best in Elvis. The final night was a struggle. We recorded Love Me, Love the Life I Lead, but Elvis's performance was one of his worst. He was clearly singing in a key that was too high, and it sounded forced and unflattering. After these sessions, the Christmas album turned out to be a disappointment, even though it sold well. The gospel album was still incomplete, and we had to do more sessions the following month. The secular material was released in a haphazard way, and the album Elvis Now was a mix of new and old songs. Critics gave it mixed reviews, but some pointed out that Elvis needed to recover the fire and passion he used to have in his music. When we got back into the studio in June, Elvis seemed to be in better voice and mood. We started with Until It's Time for You to Go, but the arrangement was almost the same as before, so there wasn't much change. Then we did Put Your Hand in the Hand, which was a pleasant but not very exciting pop gospel song. Reach Out to Jesus was much better. It was a lovely ballad, and Elvis's voice was tender and vulnerable. He was really into the music, and the arrangement built up to a powerful climax. It was a great performance, and it showed that Elvis could still sing with a lot of feeling. The next 2 nights were tougher. Elvis got frustrated with the musicians and singers, and he eventually walked out. He Is My Everything and There Is No God But God were both lackluster. He Is My Everything was just a reworked version of There Goes My Everything, and There Is No God But God was overly simplistic and lacked care. To finish the album, we recorded I, John and Bosom of Abraham, which Elvis knew well and sang with real enthusiasm. These two short numbers were highlights of the album, and showed what it could have been if more songs were like this. On the last night, Elvis tried to remake I'll Be Home on Christmas Day. It was a bit of a mystery why he chose to remake some songs but not others. It was like he was torn between not wanting to be in the studio and still caring enough to try to improve his earlier work. I couldn't help but notice the contrast between Elvis's studio recordings and his live performances in 1971. It seemed like the studio sessions were just to fulfill his contract with RCA, and the lack of inspiration was clear. The songs from the gospel album, He Touched Me, were hit or miss. Some tracks, like Reach Out to Jesus and He Touched Me, were really powerful, but others, like There Is No God But God, just didn't land. The album won a Grammy, but it felt like the weakest of his gospel albums. I wish they had used some of the fantastic live recordings from the previous year, instead of these lackluster studio tracks. By the time Elvis hit the stage in Lake Tahoe and Las Vegas later in 1971, things started to pick up. He added new songs like I'm Leavin' and It's Impossible to his set. The reviews were better, and it seemed like Elvis was more engaged. One reviewer even mentioned how Elvis would put on a rubber monkey mask during his shows, which must have been pretty funny. The concerts were tighter and more exciting, and it felt like Elvis was back on top of his game. A recording from his Boston show in November showed just how much he had improved. The pacing of the show was different, more like what we'd see in Elvis on tour the following year. In February 1972, RCA decided to record some of Elvis's shows in Las Vegas. They wanted to create a live studio hybrid album, similar to That's the Way It Is. The show was evolving, and Elvis was dropping older songs in favor of new, more theatrical numbers. One of the new songs, Never Been to Spain, had a dramatic arrangement that really showcased Elvis's voice. Another standout was You Gave Me a Mountain, a powerful ballad that Elvis made his own. The best, though, was An American Trilogy. This medley of Dixie, All My Trials, and Battle Hymn of the Republic was a showstopper. Elvis's version was grand and emotional, and it became one of his most beloved tracks. Elvis also recorded The Impossible Dream, a song from the musical The Man of La Mancha. It was a slower, more majestic version than the one he later recorded live. Another song, It's Over, was a quiet, tender ballad that Elvis sang with a lot of feeling. However, the big finish felt out of place and kind of ruined the mood. It's Impossible, a Perry Como song, was nice but a bit too sweet for my taste. On the other hand, A Big Hunk O' Love got a great reworking that really pumped up the audience. The reviews for this Las Vegas season were mostly positive. One critic even said it was Elvis's best performance yet, praising his attention to the songs and the audience, but not everyone was happy. A critic named Robert Hilburn wrote a condescending letter to a fan, saying he found the show disappointing. He criticized Elvis's choice of material and questioned his commitment. But if you listen to the bootleg of that opening night, Elvis was clearly focused and giving it his all. Hilburn seemed to be missing the point. Then, in March 1972, Elvis went back into the studio. The sessions were short, but they produced some great tracks. It felt like Elvis was back on form, and the live recordings from the previous year were proof that he was still a force to be reckoned with. 1972 was a year that saw me, Elvis, face a series of challenges that seemed to spark a renewed focus and energy in my work. I had always thrived under pressure, and this year was no different. In April, I was set to go on tour again, this time with film cameras following me for a second MGM documentary. Then in June, I had the big show at Madison Square Garden in New York, a city that I felt hadn't been kind to me in the past. But before all that, I needed to get back into the studio and record some new hits. My last few singles hadn't done well, and I was under a lot of pressure to deliver. For these sessions, I decided to work with the same band I had been using for my live shows, except for Emery Gordy on bass, who was new. The atmosphere in the studio was relaxed but focused. We worked through over 20 takes of a new song called Separate Ways, which I co-wrote with Red West. It was a ballad about a love that had gone wrong, and I felt it deeply, especially since my marriage with Priscilla was falling apart. Instead of belting out the lyrics, I tried to get inside the song and deliver a more restrained, heartfelt performance. The song was released as a single, and it did pretty well, reaching number 20 on the charts. I even rehearsed it for my live shows, though I'm not sure if I ever performed it on stage. Next we recorded For the Good Times, a song by Chris Christopherson. I gave it a laid-back performance, but the arrangement was a bit too bland. It didn't have the same impact as Separate Ways. Despite that, I started singing it in my live shows, even though the studio version wasn't released for over 20 years. Where Do I Go From Here was a song that really showed how my career was at a crossroads. It was written by Paul Williams, who also wrote for the Carpenters. The original version had a folky feel, but my version was heavier and more pop-oriented. The arrangement didn't work well, and my vocal performance was a bit awkward. I was running out of breath during the long lines, and it sounded like I hadn't fully learned the lyrics. The strings and brass only made it sound more cluttered. The night after that, we recorded Burning Love. At first, I wasn't sure I wanted to do the song, but the band encouraged me, and after 6 takes, we had a hit. The arrangement was dynamic and uncluttered, and my vocal performance was relaxed but powerful. It became one of my biggest hits of the 70s, reaching number 2 on the charts. Fool was a ballad by Carl Sigman and James Last. It was harmless but didn't go anywhere. The arrangement was aimless, and the key changes made it sound predictable. Despite its flaws, it was still released as a single, and Billboard called it a strong ballad effort. On the final night of recording, we did Always on My Mind. This song would become one of my most beloved, especially in the UK, where it was voted the country's favorite Elvis song in 2013. I gave it a restrained performance, and the arrangement was reminiscent of I Just Can't Help Believin', with its fake ending. The last song we recorded was It's a Matter of Time. It had a country feel and wasn't my most memorable, but I was sincere in my vocal performance, and I tried it out in my live shows the following year. Despite the quality of these recordings, they were wasted. RCA had planned a standing room only album, which would have paired these new studio recordings with live recordings from February. It would have been one of my strongest albums of the 70s, but it was abandoned. Instead, songs like Burning Love and Separate Ways ended up on budget releases filled with older, forgettable tracks from my movie years. Critics were harsh, with Lester Bangs in Rolling Stone calling one of these albums a whole Lazy Susan of the same old shit. The market was flooded with Elvis releases, and many of them were subpar. The better songs from the March 1972 sessions ended up on budget albums, while 2 of the weaker songs, Fool and Where Do I Go From Here, were released on a regular album called Elvis, which fans called the Fool album. It was a mixed bag, with some great piano songs from the previous year, but also some over-the-top performances like Padre and Love Me, Love the Life I Lead. Despite its flaws, it was a step up from Elvis Now, and Billboard called it a mellowed effort. The rehearsals for the Elvis on Tour documentary were a different experience. In 1970, there was a sense of joy and spontaneity, but in 1972, I was more focused and serious. There was less joking around, and I seemed more like a man doing a job than someone who was passionate about music. The only moments of real emotion came during the gospel songs, where I sang with J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet. It was as if my guard dropped, and I was truly relaxed and happy. During the live shows, I was in good form, especially in San Antonio on April 18th. The concert was more relaxed than the one at Madison Square Garden, but there were signs that my commitment was slipping. I was more focused on image and making an impression, and some of the ad-libs were becoming routine. I was the consummate professional, but the spontaneity and inspiration of the earlier years were starting to fade. Despite these challenges, 1972 was a year of growth and new challenges for me. I was still finding ways to connect with my audience and create music that resonated, even as my personal life became more complicated. I remember the reviews of Elvis on Tour, the film that was supposed to be a deep look into the life of the king, but ended up being more of a flashy concert movie. Critics like Vincent Canby from the New York Times said the directors, Pierre Adage and Robert Abel, seemed nervous and ended up making a movie that showed Elvis as a bland, almost idealized figure. It was as if they were too scared to show the real Elvis, the one who was struggling with the pressures of fame. There were some glimpses of the real Elvis, like when he was backstage, or when he sang gospel songs, or when he listened to the Stamps Quartet. But these moments were too few, and the movie felt like it was hiding behind a shiny facade. There was a lot of talk about how Elvis looked in the film, especially compared to just a few years earlier. He seemed pale, a bit heavier, and his face looked puffy. Even his hair, which used to be wild and free, now looked thick and unruly. One part of the movie that stood out was the montage during Love Me Tender, where they showed clips of Elvis kissing his co-stars from his old movies. It was hard to believe it was the same man, given how much he had changed in such a short time. The film was flashy, with cool split-screen effects and clever editing, but it felt like it was trying too hard. It was more about looking good than telling a real story. Critics like Canby pointed out that we learned even less about Elvis from this movie than we did from That's the Way It Is, a film from a few years earlier. When Elvis went on tour, especially in 1972, he faced a mix of praise and criticism. One of the first big shows was in San Antonio, where a writer named Sam Kindrick wrote a not-so-flattering review. He said Elvis's new look and mannerisms didn't suit him, and he made fun of Elvis's costume, comparing him to Batman. But the fans didn't take kindly to this. 2 weeks later, Kindrick had to print letters from angry fans who accused him of being unfair and not even attending the concert. This was just the beginning of a trend where local reporters had to be careful not to upset the dedicated Elvis fans. One of the most significant shows of 1972 was at Madison Square Garden in June. It was a big deal, and RCA recorded both the afternoon and evening shows. The evening show was released just 10 days later, making it the first full Elvis concert on record. The energy was incredible, and the show was fast-paced and intense. The band started with Also Sprach Zarathustra, the dramatic intro that got the crowd ready for Elvis. Then came That's All Right, which was played much faster and with more power than the old versions. The next song, Proud Mary, was better than the 1970 version, with a faster pace and a better groove. Never Been to Spain was new and impressive, but Elvis sounded a bit out of breath at the start. The song picked up once the louder section began, but the tempo felt a bit too fast. You Don't Have to Say You Love Me was played faster too, and it lost some of the emotional depth of the studio version. The first few songs were a non-stop barrage of sound, with little variation. Elvis kept the intensity high with You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' and Polk Salad Annie, both of which were powerful but lacked the nuance of earlier recordings. After 6 loud songs in a row, Elvis finally brought the energy down a bit with a sequence of his old hits. Love Me was decent, but it felt like he wasn't taking it too seriously. All Shook Up was rushed, and Heartbreak Hotel was more bluesy and serious. The medley of Teddy Bear and Don't Be Cruel was already becoming a bit redundant, and Love Me Tender was half-hearted. Elvis then sang The Impossible Dream, which was faster than the Vegas version and lost some of its majesty. Hound Dog got a fun revamp, and Suspicious Minds was intense but lost some meaning in the faster tempo. For the Good Times was a nice break from the high energy, but it seemed out of place in the set list. An American Trilogy and Funny How Time Slips Away were both different from the studio versions, with less intensity and changed lyrics. The show ended with I Can't Stop Loving You and Can't Help Falling in Love. Critics like Chris Chase from the New York Times and Don Heckman praised Elvis's control over the audience and the impact of his performance. They compared him to a champion boxer, standing victorious at the end of the show. But they also hinted that the performance was more about making an impression than showcasing his vocal talents. The arrangements were often bombastic and fast, suggesting that Elvis was more focused on the show's impact rather than the quality of his singing. Despite this, the concerts were a testament to Elvis's enduring presence and the power he had over his audience. I spent the rest of 1972 in Las Vegas, playing shows and getting ready for the biggest moment of my career. The August shows in Vegas were a bit different. The songs were the same, but I felt slower and less energetic. I added some new ballads like My Way and Fever, and even worked on Faded Love and Something during rehearsals. But the press was more interested in my divorce than my music. In November, things got better. I got some good reviews, even from people who didn't like me before. Robert Hilburn said my voice had a balance of country, gospel, and blues that no one else had. But there was pressure to tour outside the US, and I kept saying I would, even though it seemed less likely. The press called it the UK Tour Ajo. To make up for not touring, we planned something big. Aloha from Hawaii was announced in the fall. It was going to be a live satellite broadcast, a first for me and a big deal. The press conference to announce it was strange. I felt distant and said the whole thing was hard to comprehend. It wasn't like me to be so quiet. On January 12th and 14, 1973, I did 2 shows in Hawaii. The first one was a rehearsal, but it was recorded just in case. The main show started with Also Sprach Zarathustra and C.C. Rider. The songs were grander now, with the orchestra and backing singers, but my voice sounded different, thinner, and a bit nasal. Burning Love was strained, and I had trouble with the long notes. Something was a big letdown. I mumbled some lines and didn't seem to care. It was a huge night, but I didn't feel the pressure. You Gave Me a Mountain was better, but my voice still sounded thin. I felt tired and like I was just going through the motions. Steamroller Blues was silly, and I struggled with the quiet parts. My Way was a highlight. It was powerful and tender, and I finally felt like I was really singing. Love Me and Johnny Be Good were okay, but not as good as they used to be. It's Over was better, and Blue Suede Shoes and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry were stripped back, which worked well. I Can't Stop Loving You was a bit lazy, and Hound Dog was just a quick throwaway. What Now My Love was good with a dramatic build-up, but it didn't add much new. Fever was fun and tongue-in-cheek, but Welcome to My World was boring. Suspicious Minds and I'll Remember You were nice, and the medley of Long Tall Sally and Whole Lot of Shackin' Goin' On was okay. An American Trilogy was the highlight. I sang it with patriotic fervor, and it was one of the best performances of the song. A Big Hunk O' Love was solid, and Can't Help Falling in Love ended the show with me throwing my cape into the audience. After the show, I went back on stage to record more songs for the US broadcast. These were low-key and intimate, and some of the best performances from the special. Early Morning Rain was better than the studio version, and the Hawaiian songs were charming. Aloha from Hawaii might not have been my best show, but it was historic. It was a #1 album, but it was the last real high of my career. After that, things started to go downhill. I went back to Vegas and gave lackluster performances. In the summer, I struggled in the studio, and by 1976, it was clear to everyone that something was wrong. My last years were tough, and my performances became less consistent. The decline was fast and shocking. I remember the time in 1973 when things didn't seem to be going so well for me. I was on stage, but it felt like I wasn't really there. My performances were subdued, and I was distant, both from the songs I was singing and from the audience. I used to put everything into my new songs, but that year, it was almost like I was just going through the motions. I was in good voice, but there was no real connection, and it was hard to tell if I was really enjoying what I was doing. Then came the tour in April. It started in Phoenix, and people were complaining about the sound system. They said it made my songs sound like mush, and fans had trouble hearing me. But later in the tour, things improved. Wayne Carlson called my show a carnival, and he talked about my powerful voice and how I enjoyed posing for the fans. He said I didn't take myself too seriously, which the audience loved. It was a mix of both good and bad, I guess. I was having fun, but maybe I wasn't giving it my all, and that could be seen as a negative. The tour in Lake Tahoe was a bit of a roller coaster. I did a special Mother's Day benefit show, and I was in good spirits. I even sang Faded Love, which I rarely did. The crowd loved it, but the engagement didn't go as planned. I got a bad review in Variety, which said I looked and sounded worse than ever. I was overweight, and my voice was weak. It was a tough time. The next month, I was on tour again. I had a near-death experience in St. Louis. I was found unconscious in bed, and Dr. George Nishapoulos had to save me. Despite that, I still went on stage and performed. It wasn't my best show, but I made it through. The night before, in Cincinnati, A fan named Judy Halsinger had a great time. She met me after the show, and I even kissed her. It was a moment of kindness in a tough period. RCA wanted me to record new songs, so I went to Stax Studios in Memphis. I was late and sometimes not in the best shape, but we managed to record some songs. Some were good and some were not so great. I tried to do something different with If You Don't Come Back and 3 Corn Patches, but they didn't really work out. I did better with I've Got a Thing About You Baby and For All Time's Sake. The latter was especially meaningful because I was going through a tough time with Priscilla. Raised on Rock was a bit of a joke, and Girl of Mine was just dull. The session ended abruptly when my microphone was stolen, and I walked out. The summer residency at the Hilton in Las Vegas was another low point. I was having fun, but it was self-indulgent. I did things like sing What Now My Love, while lying on a bed and mixed up the lyrics of Bridge Over Troubled Water with Suspicious Minds. I even sang a version of Love Me Tender that was a clear message to the hotel management. They had fired a waiter I liked, and I was angry about it. The reviews were not kind. Variety called me a somnolent, lackadaisical superstar who was winding down. It was a tough time, but I kept going. As 1973 rolled on, things got a bit rough for me, but I tried to keep going. People didn't really know how tough it was. They might have thought I was having a bad day or acting a bit strange, but they didn't see the whole picture. There were some hospital stays and weight issues, but I still had fans hoping I'd tour the world. My manager, Colonel Parker, later said I didn't want to play outdoors, which was why the world tour never happened. But it was more complicated than that. In September, I had a studio session at my Palm Springs home. I was supposed to finish some songs from a previous session, but I ended up working on new stuff with my backup singer's voice. We only managed to complete a few tracks, but Sweet Angeline turned out really well. It had a nice feel to it, and the vocals blended beautifully. I also recorded a heartfelt song called I Miss You, which was simple but powerful. Another track, Are You Sincere, was a bit over the top, but it had its moments. These songs, along with some from the earlier session, were put on an album called Raised on Rock. It wasn't the best album, but it had some good, upbeat tracks. The album cover made me look a bit like a lizard, which was weird, but whatever. Critics didn't say much, and it didn't do as well as I hoped on the charts. In October, I had to go to the hospital for what they called recurrent pneumonia. I stayed there for a while and got some strong medicine, which made things a bit difficult, but I came out in November feeling better. For the rest of the year, I took it easy and spent time at my girlfriend Linda Thompson's place. We recorded some songs just for fun, and I played old favorites like CC Rider and That's All Right. It was a nice break from the big stage shows and felt really good. In December, I went back to the studio and felt a lot better. The first song we did was a gospel track called I Got a Feeling in My Body. It was energetic, and I really enjoyed singing it. Then we did a love song called It's Midnight, which was a bit too much in the chorus, but I gave it my all. We also recorded a fun country song called You Asked Me To, and a funky tune called If You Talk in Your Sleep. I had a blast with those. There were a couple of songs by my backup singer's voice. Mr. Songman was a quiet country number, and Thinking About You was a catchy, folky song. Both were nice additions. Love Song of the Year had some clunky lyrics, but I loved the big melody. Help Me was a country song with a religious feel, and it fit me well. I started playing it live, and it became a regular in my shows. My Boy was a bit dramatic, but it was a hit in some places. Loving Arms was another one where I tried to keep it together, but I oversang a bit. Good Time Charlie's Got the Blues was more relaxed, and I had fun with the band. I even made a joke about the lyrics once on stage. It was a moment where I thought about being more open with my audience, but I decided to keep things light. One of the best songs from the session was Talk About the Good Times. It was an upbeat country number, and I had a blast recording it. Even though it was cut short, it was a highlight. 1973 was a mixed year, but I learned a lot. I tried to make the best of it, and I always hoped the next song would be the one that would bring everything back to where it should be.